I think it would, I mean, I'd like to comment just for everyone's benefit here, given what we've been talking about. And that is that the one downside, the ambiguity is really good from my point of view, because I work with artists. And so I'm the first person to say to anyone in this room, if you ever got an inquiry from the faculty, from the university, then contact me and let's sit down and have a conversation. Because I think it's really important that you have a balanced playing field when you're doing this. And I think that's the downside of having this kind of a policy, is that the chilling effect that you're speaking about, the hammer, people's fear, there is already that fear. The fact that they don't understand the language already means that they're going to be afraid to come to you and say, you know, this is what I'm doing. And so there are going to be people, so in a way, you know, what would be a great art project would be actually for us to challenge it as and then almost play it out to see just how far the Board of Governors is willing to go to enable this to be free. But that's for another day. But I think it's, you know, there's a real tension there. But I think it's great that you've got ambiguity, because if you didn't have ambiguity, you would have David saying, oh, well, no, we'll just stand here like this, which he would love to be able to do.
But do you think, I doubt if there's any kind of policy language, other than the kind that is very explicitly the hammer, that will avoid some of those contradictions. So it really comes down to an issue of whether you have a policy at all, ultimately. But then the danger of that, if we don't have that policy, is it defaults to other policies in common law, but also at another, and that, as we explored that, because we were discussing it at some point, let's not have a policy. And
the reality is that your point about the University Act is extremely important, because many institutions are governed by other pieces of legislation that simply state, like Blaze's point about Crown copyright, we own it, therefore you can do nothing. And that is archaic, but it is rooted in a very, not necessarily an understanding of creation, but rather an understanding of property. And that's a lot of what we've been talking about with Lawrence Lessig's work and such.
It's inconceivable to think about the history of art without talking about the history of borrowing and the history of mashing and all the various ways in which artists and creators inevitably engage in processes of interaction with pre-existing and historical works. I mean, it's almost a joke to suggest that doesn't happen. It's constant. So then, you know, if you get too heavily into the legal side of this, you look at a Van Gogh and it has an influence on your painting, and then along comes the Van Gogh estate and says, well, you haven't copied anything, but we see an influence. I mean, that's how subtle it can get and how crazy it can get at the same time. So I think the way this policy was crafted, and the wording is I said intentionally ambiguous, but very carefully ambiguous, is intended to actually kind of leave everything in a steady state, almost saying, well, you know, this is going to go on. And policies should be living, breathing kinds of things in language. They should change and be changeable as circumstances shift. And that's the intention behind this way of writing it as well. But it's not a permanent policy. The board has a very, very minimal understanding of this, you know, except for one or two members on it. And it would be very difficult to have even this kind of discussion with the board about it. So, you know, the danger is whenever policies are reopened, that people who have no connection to that initial debate suddenly come in and say, what are you talking about, you know? And there's patents coming flying out of this place, or there's incredible paintings flying out of this place. You know, there's public art that people are making money on. Why aren't we making money on it? You know, and so on. And preventing that debate from happening is sometimes better than getting into it.
So speaking of this ambiguity within the policy, how does, and you said that the idea was to prevent, you know, a potentially future administration who don't necessarily have the same views as you do from, you know, bringing in this hammer that we were speaking of. But how does the ambiguity do that? Like, in my mind, sometimes ambiguity can help those kinds of administration.
It can. it's a double-edged sword. So it works both ways, you know, and it does depend, and that's the unfortunate thing, and that's, I think, where lawyers go crazy, because it obviously depends on the individual. I mean, you know, that's the illusion also of policy. It's the illusion of government policy. It's the idea that, you know, it's the idea that you create a kind of biblical language, and then because it's absolute, everyone will understand it, which they don't, and then everyone will follow it, which they don't. So why start? Why start with the absolute when the absolute never works, other than for the Pope? I won't talk about that. I won't talk about the Pope. Yeah. I made a reference to religion in one class that I was talking to, and I actually got a complaint, so I'm very careful. And that tells you a lot about free speech in our institution. Be careful what you say about the Pope. Yes, sorry. So I answered your question by saying ambiguity is good. I would answer it further by saying that ambiguity is fundamental. All language. There wouldn't be a court system, and there wouldn't be lawyers if there wasn't, in fact, fundamentally so much ambiguity in our understanding of what we do, our communications between each other, how we operate in our lives on a daily basis. So, you know, you can't. It doesn't say this policy is intentionally ambiguous, because that would be silly.
So coming back to, I guess, the idea of substantial commercial value and returns, let's just talk about the different areas. So obviously we've talked about a bit about design and specifically the anecdote you gave, but how does that really work for design students? So what kind of things what types of things could they potentially create that would fall under this policy?
That's impossible to answer. No, seriously.
Fair enough.
I mean, you know, they could. I mean, because I'll give you examples. There were two students in industrial design who created an extraordinary spring mechanism for Coast Guard boats. You know how those boats go out at high speed and they bounce on the waves? So these springs absorbed about 60% more of the shock than would otherwise have been the case. Major. You know, we actually were working with the students and talking to them about, well, how could you translate that into a job for yourselves? Could we suggest, well, why don't you start a company, because it's a great idea. And I don't know what they did with it. Nothing much happened afterwards. The Coast Guard loved it. So it's an impossible question to answer. You know, is there a particular kind of thing that's going to happen? No, it's unpredictable, which is exactly why it's so hard to manage. You know, you kind of have to discuss it when it occurs. And in most cases, I think, at least from my perspective, the goal would be a discussion to help the students monetize their creativity. I mean, our goal is for students to sort of power themselves out of this institution and be empowered enough that you find a life for yourself that is meaningful. Our goal is not to, from an educational point of view, from a learning point of view, or from an institutional point of view, just to simply say, well, you're here, we're really worried about what you might do, and we need to know what you're going to do before you do it, which you may not know because most creativity doesn't have an endpoint clearly in mind. And then once you do once you're really, really innovative, we're going to come down and hit you hard. It doesn't work. So part of it has to do with a common cultural consensus that has to be built, and that goes to the point of the need for you. We're talking about doing this in first year, and having a first year course that really talks this through more clearly, so that you're in first year, you're talking it through, you understand what consensus is about, what commonly understood agreements are about, what the common space that we share, and what kinds of assumptions underlie that. Because there are a set of assumptions that may not be visible to you. You walk in, you assume, well, if I'm going to create a great artwork and sell it as a piece of public artwork, and I might get $100 grand for it, which, by the way, one student did, then, you know, will they come back at me? And the answer is no.